Okay, so it gives me great pleasure to welcome Professor Anthony Steed to Building New Realities. Out of all the people we've had on the podcast, Professor Steed is eminently qualified to talk about building new realities. And just as an interesting side note, the last time I met Anthony was when he was doing due diligence on Future Visual for our tech Vision XR. So I'm happy to say that Future Visual passed your due diligence and has had a really great relationship with John Bates as our chairman, and we've doubled in size since that. So welcome, Professor Steed.
Thank you very much. I'm always happy to talk about my favourite topic.
Excellent. Well, as I say, you are eminently qualified. And I remember actually when we did due diligence, I was like, I'd love to pick that man's brains and find out a little bit more about his views on immersive. So here we go. As a bit of background, you are currently professor at UCL in virtual environments. Is that right? Yeah, in virtual environments and computer graphics. Of course, you go around the world doing residencies or fellowships at other academic facilities, and your research area is specified as around real-time interactive virtual environments, with particular interest in VR, AR, and what I'm most excited to hear about, novel forms of interaction. The podcast is called Building New Realities. How long have you been working in this field? How long have you been interested in immersive tech? And what was your sort of background from degree level? Did you go straight from degree into immersive tech? And I'd love to find out a bit more.
Right, okay. So I've been in the field for quite a long time, in that I'm almost up for 30 years. So I got interested in virtual reality when it was sort of more of a science fiction thing. So the type of thing you saw on Tomorrow's World, which for those of you who aren't in the UK is a now no longer running TV show, but it was a science programme in the BBC in the UK, very popular in the 80s and 90s. And on that, we started to see sort of virtual reality systems coming out of the aerospace industry in the 1980s. So my first try of immersive virtual reality is when I was interviewed for a PhD. So I was a mathematician by first training, but I like maths. I do like maths, but I wanted to do something a bit more practical. And I did a module on computer graphics, and I thought, oh yes, that's the thing I want to do. I like that. It's quite practical, but you get to do all the maths. And then I ended up choosing between a few different offers for PhD places. I ended up at Professor Mel Slater's group at Queen Mary, who had a Provision 100 system. So this was a fully immersive turnkey virtual reality system. You bought it off the shelf. Obviously, we're talking six figures probably for the system. But it came with a head-mounted display, came with head trackers, hand trackers, and an image generator. Of course, that was quite expensive at the time. But it was fully immersive. You could put on the headset, you could look around, you could see your hands, see your body. And we quickly learned that the problems weren't anything to do with maths. There were interesting technical problems to make this work, but the more interesting thing was how people reacted to this system, how they behaved, what we could intuit that they were thinking about the environment, and henceforth I've just been interested in that sort of effect, really, which is, what is it about immersive systems that makes them qualitatively different than interacting with other types of user interface? And of course, when that was 1992, by the way, when I interviewed and thought, yeah, that's fantastic. That's what I want to do. And henceforth, I've been working on immersive systems.
So did your sort of interest or specialism quickly sort of almost branch into the psychology of people's reaction to immersive environments, as opposed to sort of the hardcore maths and solving vision and graphics problems? Or was it a sort of, equal split? Presumably, from what you just said, you were going into it thinking this is going to be a technical challenge, there's some hard maths to do here. Sure. But quite quickly, it obviously became a big psychological and pedagogic, perhaps.
Absolutely. So we were in a computer science department, first off. So that's Professor Slater and I, Mel and I, were interested in computer graphics. He'd written a computer graphics textbook, and we were employed on I was working on a project which was about about lighting, as far as I recall. So they were sponsored by a lighting company who wanted to use virtual reality to visualize lighting solutions, because there is a market. The market for home light bulbs is uninteresting, but there is a market for installing light fittings in large conference centres, where you want to get it right, you want it to look good, but also you want it to be maintainable. So the thought was that you could visualize the lighting solution, and then you could sell these lighting solutions, and that's sort of traditional virtual. That's what people thought virtual reality would be good for at the time, because there had been these famous case studies of building visualization in virtual reality that helped people solve some key problems, like avoid engineering mistakes. And that, for a long time, that was what sustained the industry, was engineering practices that needed robust, needed to make certain engineers, certain designers more effective at their jobs by giving them easy ways to see things or visualize things. But what we found in a series of experiments was that people were reacting to the scenario as if it was real, and we didn't have the terminology at the time. There was this concept of telepresence and presence, which has sort of been bandied around in a few articles from 1991, 92, and it had been mentioned earlier in the sort of telerobotics community that people were behaving as if they were there. But nobody really had any science to get into that. So what things would you change? We, like many people, we thought the graphics had to be better. But that was very hard at the time, because the graphics was already as good as it could be. And we were just looking at orders of magnitude of improvement in graphics processors. But very early on, we realized there's something to do with the body, and yourself is in there. And again, we didn't have the language and the understanding of neuroscience for 15 years afterwards. That something about seeing yourself in the environment was very important. And we were probably the first group that did a virtual pit. So you stand on the edge of a virtual cliff and look down, and the reaction to that is very visceral. So it is in your gut. People that are afraid of heights sort of do actually respond to it as if it's a real height, in that, back in those days, we counted swear words. We counted people taking off the head-mounted display and telling us we were nasty people, and things like that. So people sort of crouching down, preparing to step back, and so on. Now, much later on, people sort of brought in the sort of how the knowledge that came out of neuroscience about how what was happening. So people don't understand virtual reality is not reality, right? The brain is a complex machine which understands sensory perceptions and then makes decisions. And some of those need to be made very short term, and therefore happen at quite a low level, such as preparing to react to threats. So of course you can, like you can in a sort of, if you go to a ghost house or something like that, you can prepare yourself to not be shocked.
Yeah, tense up, kind of regulate your breathing.
But it's a process, right? And if you just threaten somebody, they will react. And there's a whole YouTube genre, which I don't say is very ethical, but of people sort of shocking, even in virtual reality, but giving people, shocking them with something that there's an immediate response to. Which is difficult for people to avoid, right? Because it is it's an immediate response where the brain doesn't have time to think through. And that then led to, obviously, there were many technical problems. So I've sort of spanned between the two. Between the sort of technical problems and the sort of user evaluation side. So my group, originally under Mel and then now with me leading it, is sort of trying to span between making technical changes to the system, but then proving that, sort of having some impact on the user experience, be it, sort of feeling as if they're more immersed and therefore react as if it's real more easily, or taking another stance, which is making it more usable, so making it more fun or more adoptable by their users.
And what do you call that sort of study of people's reactions, and not only people's reactions, but it's people's presence or their belief that they are not necessarily in another environment? Because what's so fascinating about VR is you're in a graphics-driven environment, but you do have those bodily reactions that you just described. So I was wondering, does that in the way that pedagogy describes processes of learning and teaching, how would you describe the actual research?
Well, you use the term presence, actually, and I think most people would. There are so many definitions that it's almost a class of definition of something about the response being a sort of related to something's analogy in the real world. This response as if real, and B sort of being somewhat unique in that it would be something you couldn't get in another style of interface. So people do focus on that. They call it sort of presence generally, because there's no such sense as presence, right? So people used to use the term sense of presence a lot. I think we've come to the understanding that doesn't mean very much in itself, in that various definitions, Jaron Lanier's recent book has 100 definitions of what virtual reality is, and you could come up with 100 definitions of presence, but we all know it when we see it. We all know that somebody's reacting to this when, as if somehow, if it's real, when they see something, a very fluid interaction. So as a computer scientist, you can take that back to almost, there's a lovely definition, which is, I forget who to attribute it to, but perhaps I can look it up for the podcast, which is successfully supported interaction. So somebody looks at the environment, says, I should be able to do that, goes ahead and does it. And they don't have to reason about it as the same way that they do on a desktop, which is, does it do that or does it do it? Because they're using innate skill or innate knowledge. And they can look at something, interpret it very quickly, and then just get on with it. And
we're doing it, because the desktop gives you a sense of detachment. Although obviously we're very accustomed to using mice to drive around, it does feel detached as opposed to just getting on with it.
But there's measures of that which are really novel, which we're trying to get into, which is creativity, because the environment affords a lot of adoption of skill. So that's the type of thing you'd look out for, is can people be creative in the environment in interesting ways? So because the desktop affords very few sort of new tools for you, but in the virtual environment, you've got a lot of things you could try and figure out how to use, and try and appropriate for yourself. And that's one of the technical challenges going forward, is how to support that, because there's a lot of reaching out, touching things, and they don't work in virtual reality at the moment. They do what you expect. It's a door that doesn't open because nobody programmed it, and that's the technical challenge, is supporting this sort of feedback loop of building confidence that I know what to do because I can interpret what I see.
I mean, in a similar way, there's a guy called Anil Seth. I don't know if you've come across him in Sussex. Who's doing a bunch of study on essentially as humans, our brains putting together what we commonly call reality, but essentially we're making sense of a bunch of inputs that on their own aren't reality, but of course our brain puts a filter on them and calls them reality. So it's kind of slightly more out there, almost on the philosophy, what is reality type line of study, but he does use VR in some of the studies, but it was quite interesting.
There's some interesting relationships between the neuroscientists and almost philosophers and virtual reality. It's not an area I specialize in, but it's interesting to read through the material on how we form hypotheses about the real world, because virtual reality is an excellent testbed for varying some of those, because of course it's under our control. So we have done that with scientists, like sort of setting up scenarios which aren't realistic, in the sense that we've controlled something which wouldn't normally be controllable, say gravity, and then use that to test help them test their understanding of how the human perception systems work. And I'll give you a lovely example of that, which is a paper where we know that the brain models gravity in the sense relative to the body, because don't have time to get into the science behind that, but we know that if you're lying down, you have a sort of awareness of which way is up, because that's and therefore which directions in particular. I'll have to get a little bit into science, we know this because you are more sensitive to things which are above you as threats. Because they can fall towards you, whereas something on the floor is not so much a threat because it can't fall upwards. And it's known that the brain models this because it's important, possibly for survival, but also, and the way to test that was in virtual reality, where you can turn gravity on and off, so things appear to be falling towards you or not. And that was a lovely collaboration.
Yeah, I mean, one of the ways we sort of consistently try to describe what we do at Future Visual to customers and clients was providing access to situations and scenarios that are physically impossible or prohibitively expensive to create in real life. And that can be across kind of basic training or sort of experiments that are difficult to facilitate in the way that you've just described, i.e. turning gravity on or off.
Yep.
What do you think of the current rise of the term metaverse, which is having its 6 months in the sun as a phrase? Hopefully it'll stick around a bit longer, but it's certainly having a bit of a I'm not even going to say resurgence, but a surgence in sort of popular commentary and possibly culture.
Well, it's obviously there's many different things underneath it, I think, and all of which have had a long history. So when Facebook talk about metaverse, I'm actually not sure what they mean, but I know what other people mean when they talk about it. There are these old visions of sort of mirror worlds that sort of inform augmented reality and location-based media. The large social space, online social PR space is, and the standards around it is fascinating. But again, it's not a new suggestion, because I did my postdoctoral work on things that could now be called metaverses, in that they were servers hosting content in 3D. You could have a browser that switched between them. And you could build infinitely large spaces. That was certainly possible, but it's been possible for a long time, because you need the internet, you need a renderer, some VR hardware, and you need a protocol. So those have been built since at least 1997, when I started doing it, but there were precursors, right? So coming out of the multi-user dungeon community, the online games community, there were sort of people proposing sort of open standards that you could see that would get bolted onto graphics in the end. And of course, that's how some of the more early and more popular sort of online games got built. They were underneath sort of very simple sort of text-based engines, which with servers that could deal with large numbers of players. So I think the current battle, the reason it's become such a hot topic at the moment is because it's a battle for the future of the application. What is an app in the future? Because so that's why I think Facebook is interested in it, is that they're not a platform holder. So we've got locked into this mode, and of course the platform holders, where you get an app is a single thing, it holds the whole screen, and that's the unit of attention, and we've moved away from sort of more complicated operating systems, and it seems to be by purpose. So even Apple and Microsoft are moving their sort of desktop platforms more towards this app model, and unfortunately that you have a gatekeeper, which is the platform provider that serves code, and that won't work at scale. Because it's formidably hard for content creators to get onto it. And the beauty of the web when it was launched was that basically anybody could make content, make servers, and compete early on. So there's a sort of gap there, which is an opportunity for somebody to come up with a system that can serve apps, which can be multi-layered, take on some of the responsibility that window managers used to have for sort of modulating between apps, being able to compose apps together. This is one of my bugbears about VR at the moment. It's a VR app that's all self-contained. It is like a mobile app, and I can't use it as a tool to serve other purposes. I can't cut and paste, for example, in and out. I can't have one app here and attach another app at the background to make a workspace. So all of those challenges boil down to something which I call the sort of who runs the code problem, like who has permission to send you code and to execute it, because the only secure way we have of doing that is the app model with a gatekeeper, or you trust a closed town like Roblox or something like that, which is where you assume that because of the tooling they have, that you don't have malicious apps. And that's been a problem for a long time. People have known that's going to be the sort of micro app problem is an operating system problem that's been around for at least 20 years. And it's the core part. I mean, because it's explicitly excluded by terms and conditions of the app stores at the moment, because it's sort of it's a breach point in their walled garden to make these things more composable. So I think that's the main challenge I think that Facebook is looking at, is how to make it available for them and others to sort of serve you content in an easier way. And then that bridges across to all these visions that people have had of how to build this sort of large scale multi-server backends where I can serve you content. And I can serve that, obviously for VR, that's not just assets, it's assets and their behaviors, which needs the code problem. Hence it's an unsolved challenge, because there's no sort of browser for VR. And I'd love to be challenged on this, but I think WebXR is very promising. But to make it to realize its potential, it's going to need a fundamental shift in what the browser can do and its underlying security model, and so on. So,
I think compared to the benefits of standalone devices with native apps, WebXR, from our experience in it, just adds and obviously limited number of devs. You always kind of going to be compromising that experience, or you're always going to be limiting it to a sort of client view type experience. Obviously, it has more capability, but it seems that quite limited compared to what you can achieve on other devices.
It may be a route, but there are some real, and it's the easiest way of serving some types of content at the moment. But there's a real challenge looming 5 years in the future, which is around the security model of the web. For example, single host servers. So if you want to build this cyberspace with people walking around between different, that's not, it's without a change in the way browsers are written. That's not possible. That I have had discussions where we're not be able to figure out a way of doing that because of the single server security model that they have. With obviously it's with get outs, but the get outs at the moment are all expressed at the front, as far as I recall from the standards.
And culturally, why do you think it's? Do you have any reflections on the timing? Obviously, we can point to things like rise in gaming, and I think COVID obviously has been a massive impetus for increased time in digital spaces. But do you have any sort of reflections on why that culturally does this fit in with a timeline? Well, obviously you've been involved, as you just described, been involved in VR and immersive for a long time. How does this sort of fit in with your timelines of expectation around the medium?
Well, timelines are always
subject to change.
Subject to change. But I think you referred to gaming and the idea that there's some massive life fulfilling sort of big systems out there which sort of people use a lot, but they're expensive and they're hard to marshal, and it's very difficult to break into. So there's a certain sense that they're fantastic, but they could be better. So and you can imagine that they'd be more pliable, so people can set up their own content creators. They're not always amenable to other people creating content. So there are lots of creators that would like to make these things, but it's not so easy. So I think part of the metaverse story is that if the tools get better and more open, and for example, you can do the thing which you could do in HTML, which is clone things with, and hopefully the permission systems behind that this time around, that you can make your own variants of something, and you can attract your own audience. So I think there's a big appetite for that as people have grown up more with these types of media as being served to us, that they want to create their own, and that's very fair. But they want to create it. One of the thought processes we have is, let's make it as simple as running a D&D session or a games evening down at the local pub. That's you get some things, you think about it, you take them along. There's not a lot of preparation. There is preparation, but it's all sort of all about the game, not learning Unity or learning some other systems in order to get to the tools. I think it's hit that, and that has converged, and I think that I see it much more driven by the content creators wanting access to this population that now has a thirst for interesting things online, which aren't just run by Blizzard and Rockstar and so on. So I think that's a good forum. It's a good sort of collection of people to want to get involved. There's also a big industry, I think, is also sort of ready for some of these materials. We've worked on many use cases over the years, and we don't do a lot of applied VR, but obviously we've had lots of people come in and say, I'd like to visualize this, or I'd like to do that. And the barrier of the tools has always been the problem. So making those, getting better at the computer graphics and getting better at the engine technology to make it more stable, more common, I think will facilitate that as well, because that's where the research is. I think it's getting rid of some of these barriers so that people can access the tools and make their own content.
And what are you more excited by? Is it enterprise or sort of consumer and immersive spaces?
Well, I think for me, the enterprise has to serve consumers, so it's a sort of part of the same equation of facilitating people to build content, and it could be big enterprises or your family. So I think that's the challenge. Is there is a way for enterprises to build content now, which is hire programmers or hire a company to build them the content they want. And the classic example of that is people that want to advertise. They can hire people to build them the apps to advertise themselves.
Perhaps I should rephrase that question, because more excited by the impact of, and when I say enterprise, let's keep it in the realm of sort of training or learning.
Yep.
So the impact of people being able to train or learn in scenarios that are difficult to attain or dangerous to repeat in real life.
Yep.
Or versus people meeting up in a social context. So to put those two pieces slightly further away from each other. One, you've got training, which is kind of safety and efficiency orientated. And then the other one is essentially meeting up in new social realms. Do either of those excite you more, or is it kind of consistent themes to both of those arenas in the way that you just described with content making?
Yes. So I think they're both excellent applications. So in and of themselves. So the difficult, dangerous, or expensive is sort of the default for VR, sort of. It's a excellent use of virtual reality. It's got lots of benefits, and it enables more efficient training, more efficient engineering, more efficient design. But the problem is the tooling. So it's making those scenarios. And my own opinion about that is it's all about it's about the social. So the thing that I think sort of critically enables this is allowing people to come together in those scenarios, but also author them. Because our experience with those, getting out, the training can be set up as, here's something you go through. That's basically PowerPoint on steroids. Here's something you do. But the benefit of training, as most people have done it outside of a more didactic sort of scenario, is let's talk about it. Let's go and review. Let's explore it. Where you need to facilitate the social. So for me, what my focus at the moment is very much on the sort of starting with the face-to-face, chatting with each other, and then building out what those people want. So the games is well served, but the games authoring isn't well served at the moment. So if I want to make new experiences, how do I build that in? How do I allow people to construct very simply? And the training end, it's okay. I can make animations, I can make scenes, I can do that already. But how do we make that much more flexible? So, for example, at the moment, two of our projects are one of them, Daniele, is doing scene population by sketching roughly. So if you want a chair or a table in your scene, you sketch roughly what you want, and then there are databases of these things, but he fetches the one that looks like the one you sketched. So that's in at one extreme, but you can imagine that being used in any sort of context. It's designed for people to build it themselves rather than. And
you're drawing in world, are you, or do you have
you're drawing in world
UI with a sketch pad?
So for the people that know a little bit about it, it's a bit like tilt brush. You sketch a little bit in a tilt brush like thing in 3D, and then it says that, and then sort of an artificial intelligence system says that looks most like this chair in a database of 50,000 chairs that I've got, because there are databases of these things online. So rather than trying to type in, it's got Queen Anne legs. If you don't know what those are, but you can sketch them and say it's got these sort of curvy legs with feet on, and it will find the one you want. And the opposite extreme is sort of doing it for crowds. So if you want to program sort of human behaviors, which again is a huge active topic, if you want to program a sort of virtual human to do something, then we're doing it by demonstration. So there are, building AI systems that are driven by motion capture and planning that is sort of constructed for a particular purpose. But then when they come across a situation which they've never encountered before, they do something wrong, we can point it out and say, in this situation, you wouldn't do that, you'd do this instead. And then hopefully, this is early stages, would then go and the system would learn to sort of make a more intelligent character that sort of reacts to more unknown situations in a more plausible way. It's not going to be intelligent, but it's going to be plausible, so that you can start to populate sort of scenarios that you might want.
Interesting. And what's been your favourite project that you've worked on to date?
You
could just say the one you're working on at the moment, but I'd love to.
A favourite project. Well, one of the things that it's not a project, but it's a sort of theme is latency of the system. So if you go and talk to my academic colleagues, they'll sometimes tell you I'm the guy that sort of gets boring about latency on occasion, because I think it's a critical part of the environment. So obviously in the academic world in the 1990s, when we started off, latency of the system I think was probably around 100 to 150 milliseconds. And today we consider that completely unacceptable. And it only came down relatively slowly. But But we sort of kept pointing it out, and then we built systems to measure latency. Then I had an excellent student called Sebastian who then built a system with very, very, very little latency. So its end-to-end latency was less than a millisecond. The system latency, less than a millisecond. And of course, now modern systems have a latency of roughly 18 milliseconds or slightly lower. And I think we thought that was good, but now we're starting to probe these systems are going to get faster because there are effects that are actually sub 18 milliseconds, and that's really interesting. So they're good, they're usable, but they're not. It's not like perceiving the real world yet. I think we can go much, much lower. And of course, if you move to the networking world, then all bets are off, right? I mean, you have to deal with latency as you find it. And that's got us involved in all sorts of interesting things around how do you synchronize distributed systems which just have different knowledge because of latency, and that's led to some quite interesting directions with probabilistic concurrency algorithms and so on, which sort of are we've done a couple of years ago and maybe more disruptive than we think they were at the time. It would just help us build a system at the time, but actually they think slightly differently about what the network is trying to do.
And does any of your work around latency optimization or predictive algorithms, is that contained in your is it Ubiq? I think which is a set of tools that you made open source, or just I'd love to know more about what's in Ubiq.
Right. So yes, so we released a toolkit last year called Ubiq. We've not been publicizing it too much because it's actually improving quite quickly at the moment. So Ubiq is a toolkit for building social VR systems in Unity. It's not a social VR system, but the first demo is a social VR system, which is somewhat vaguely reminiscent of Rec Room, because we like Rec Room to hang out with in lab meetings. So the idea is to facilitate people prototyping their own things, and the secondary goals are to enable sort of research on these systems, because everybody builds their own in academia at the moment. There isn't you can get a library for doing networking in Unity, but they're quite low level, so they don't help much with the sort of high level things such as how do you keep avatars, which avatars do you use, how do you synchronize things. And we spent most of our time debugging audio systems, trying to make it web compliant audio rather than using a commercial service. So a tertiary goal, that's the secondary goals. The tertiary goals was we wanted something where we had all the source code to make it completely open and to enable experiments which are compliant, because we had done some assessment of, we can't go to the labs. How do we run experiments? And some of our experiments are social. Can we use any of these big platforms? And the answer to which is no, because we need to run our own servers for data protection. And therefore, we ended up with.
So this was a COVID catalyzed project.
Yes. So we built into it some of the tools that you mentioned from our previous work on networking. In particular, some of the logging systems that we have, so to enable you to sort of debug what's going on. So that's quite sophisticated, more sophisticated than printing out to the console anyway, in a distributed sense. And also some of the sort of learnings from how to abstract things from systems. So although it's based in Unity, it does run on a wide variety of VR devices, but also on the desktop. So you can drive it. So if you don't have a headset available, you can still run it from inside Unity. You can be a full client rather than building a client. So these are some of the things that we've learned, not because of networking, just because of making our life easy in the lab over many years.
So it sort of started as an offering to the academic community, people who wanted to do social experiments. It's like, well, you're going to need this.
Yes, that was the main goal. Is is to enable people to build their own so they can experiment. There's lots of things to test on these systems, such as there are hundreds of example systems out there and they keep getting, some of them evolve, and there are many options to make. So, such as how to embed privacy, what the avatar should do, what people want to do in the environment, and you need if you want to build your own, it's a lot of getting started. So hopefully we're facilitating.
You've made that a bit easier. I mean, you mentioned Rec Room, and I've seen some of the other platforms you referenced in one of your papers, which I think was Directions for 3D User Interface Research from Consumer VR Games.
Yes.
And what, in your opinion, makes for a useful collaboration space? And I suppose there's two streams to that, aren't they? There's sort of latency dev type thoughts, and then actual client-side interactions when you're in the space together.
Yes. So a lot of systems do a good job of a focused meeting. So once you're all there, you can chat, you can marshal around resources, you can get your slides in, you can get your objects in, you can talk about it. Not so many of them are good at the sort of peripheral things. What do you do if you're 5 minutes early? What do you do if somebody's late? How do you onboard people? So I think the best platforms are thought through the sort of where does this live in somebody's professional social life? How do they get people in, and how do they? What are they doing before? What are they doing afterwards? And the very best ones don't make me wait when I'm ready. So don't make me download a 500 gigabyte patch just because. And Rec Room doesn't get that right. Most of our meetings, if we have an ad hoc meeting, somebody's late because it's patching. And that's one of these constraints about the platform. We can't get around, right? How do you ship updates to your app at the moment? Well, you go to Oculus, if it's on the Quest, or Google or Apple, and say, please push this update that then gets streamed back down again. Because they're all iterating on the code at the moment, right? It's not the assets they're iterating on. So they're not in the nice position of a more mature game engine where updates can be served directly, because you want to change the code. And that's the fundamental problem. I think, my opinion is that that's always going to be the point, right? Because it's behaviors we're interested in. It's not what things look like. So the best platforms are making that easy, and there are to get started, to bring in things that you want to use, and a lot of flexibility to allow people to do the social situation in a slightly different way. So not just having one place, but having a bit of having a lobby or so you can step outside. My main advice to people is think about what people do in real rooms, right? So people leave real meetings, right? I mean. But if you remember back when we used to do them, occasionally you'd see somebody go outside to take a phone call, right? Somebody, everybody's looking at their phones, but sometimes some people would leave, and you're in a conference. That's an established rule, right? So you would usually establish a rule saying no phones, no phones in the room. We realise you're adults and you might have to, you might need to leave, so feel free. And that's the type of thing which isn't easy at the moment, because not many systems are thought through. Well, if somebody does need to take a private phone call and they therefore take off the head-mounted display, they don't get kicked out, because it can be difficult to onboard them. So I think that the flow in and out is really important. And I think the next challenge is, how do you make things that you can use afterwards? So if you're going to do a review of a building information model, getting the tooling in there to annotate it so you can export things is really interesting. And you see a few bridgeheads there of people doing that type of thing. So sort of making the meeting an asset to be reused in the future.
And I guess an extension of that, what do you think companies or devs get consistently wrong in those kind of spaces? You've sort of touched on some of them, but I wondered if there was always a bugbear that you always saw.
Yeah, I mean, it's updating, right? So the platforms are unfortunately a little naive about launching. I think everybody's got that wrong, which is sort of, if I've got a device, then there are a very limited number of things I want to do. If I turn it on, I don't want to see a store, right? I mean, I want to, I want to have a shortcut to launching things. So that's a direct criticism of Oculus and Steam and so on, is that if I put on the head-mounted display and see my room, it should be quicker, right? I want to get out of the way most of the time and get into the app because I'm using the same app. I think the systems get too over precious about the avatars and forcing style on them. You don't want chaos, but I have no hair in all my avatars. In my favorite platforms, I have no hair because it's easy to recognize me. And I think that's the one thing that people want out of avatars and self-representations is to be able to recognize people without looking at a name tag. So forcing people into a particularly restricted set, I think I think all the platforms are evolving away from that based on feedback. But I think that that's one of the things that it would be nice to solve in Ubiq next. Would be a sort of a nice avatar system, which would be caricatures, but sort of fairly flexible, so that you can be recognizable in the system. And then I think nobody solved the challenge, because I think it's a sort of a platform problem. Is how do I get data in and out of these applications without pointing it at Office 365 or Google Docs at the back end? Because that actually does involve that is actually very hard for the developer to support at the moment. It's not cheap to do that. So the platform is certainly, we can't do it in Ubiq at the moment because all the plugins that do that cost money and are commercial. So that's not something that's easy to do. But I am thinking of, if I write something on a whiteboard in the system, I don't have the same as I have on an Android, which is to share it to other apps. So I'd be surprised if they weren't coming up with those mechanisms of what is a generic sharing mechanism in and out of these platforms. Because but again, it's a sort of a threat to the platform holder, right? And apps have to think about where they would live in that. Are they the best visualizer of some sort of chart data, or what do they do if they come across email? Somebody wants to share an email. What do they do? So I think tooling around that is coming, and I would be very happy to not have to do that in our own software.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the areas with the greatest momentum around shared objects across platforms is probably, or seems to be driven by the NFT space at the moment, with quite a lot of effort and energy around taking different objects or different avatars into those spaces. So maybe that would be one of the sort of first breakthroughs when we see sort of bigger publishers start to potentially use some sort of blockchain backbone to their games, and therefore objects and items can be moved amongst games and experiences. We touched on your directions for 3D user interface research from consumer VR games, and you covered a lot of some of your sort of learnings and recommendations from that. Is there anything else from that particular paper that was a surprise to you that came out during your research?
Yes, so that paper was crowdsourced. In the sense that we asked people that played VR games or developed VR games what they thought were good interaction techniques. And what was the most surprising? Well, the first thing that comes to mind is that there's so much creative design out there. And the one thing that surprised me is partly because of my history, was the tomato presence. So I thought that was quite surprising. And that, for those who aren't familiar, in the game Job Simulator, when you pick up an object, your hand disappears, and you just see the object move, which is nice and means that they don't have to animate the grasp of all the objects, and you can see the object clearly. So when you put it down, you don't have to get your hand out of the way because you're holding it. But of course, is contrary to what we thought about the body, because we've done a lot of work, and others have done a lot of work about what the body should look like, and this idea of body ownership. So that one That was the most. That we've got. There'll be papers on that. We'll write one if we can about what is it, challenging some of the notions that came from neuroscience about what the body should be like. Otherwise, I think the main sort of observation is that there is a tension between realistic sort of diegetic and non-diegetic interfaces, which is a term that originally came from audio, which is sounds, sort of things in the scene. You try and make a game which is a consistent place where everything's embedded into the world versus having menus. And you know, a lot of us try to avoid ever using menus in VR games, in VR systems in the past, because we thought that was just, you know, bringing in
that's old ideas.
So I did it because some of the early platforms were built around languages like Tickle TK. And that's a widget set. I had it in 3D. You could dynamically program it in the system whilst immersed. But we wanted to get away from that. So there is this tension, and so I think that design space will lead to a lot more conventions. And I think you may see a sort of partitioning of content into things that are sort of gone for the ultimate sort of, let's make it effective. And we've got static menus at the moment, but of course there's lots of prior work on dynamic menus and pie menus, which somebody will do in VR. And you'll see emergence of some very fast user interfaces. So this is one of the things, again, on the list of things why to use VR is because people like me hypothesize that it can be a really very efficient user interface because it maximizes bandwidth. So I think you'll see people build apps, and you'll look at people doing those apps, and you'll see that's incredible, like how fast they can do things in those systems, because they've got the tools and it's been heavily customized. And you can just see what's happening with Beat Saber and games like that and say, well, you know, if we build for those people, we can make them very good at their apps. Versus this sort of more traditional sort of, we'll make it a world. We'll make worlds which are very understandable because we'll make them places you can go to, and they'll be interactive, you know, and it'll be very natural interaction. So I think they may diverge, and you may get people that look at somebody using one of these very fantastic fast apps and go, what on earth? How on earth do I learn how to use it?
And so by bandwidth there, you mean the human senses bandwidth.
Yes,
and the ability to be optimized. So that's very interesting. You know, the one school of thought is like, let's build a place, a sense of place where people go and do stuff. And then stepping back from that is like, no, let's just build a tool set and not worry about the environment, but it's just optimized for performance.
Yeah, but that's what the real world is like, right? I mean, that has things which are common because they're shared by thousands, millions of people, and they're designed for it. Transport systems, for example, have to be designed to be used by many people. But a grand piano or even a workshop is, the grand piano is a convention. People study for years, and then the bandwidth of input is massive. But in a workshop, it's the same thing, but that's usually very heavily customized by the person. And I think we're looking at, both of those are a challenge, right? To get, interfaces which are sort of as good as sort of physical interface, which is a fast, but thinking sports and music as sort of being key examples, but also tools which allow me to build up, bring up, or raise up my workshop around me to make me effective at creating. And the analogy is the workbench and or the office that I work in.
Very interesting. Good to hear your analogy there of the tomato effect. I think we're doing something similar in a job for HP at the moment, but it's the coffee can where they've got to hold up these print samples, and we're like, we'll just get rid of the hand. I think part of it is because if your pinch point or your connect point to the object isn't very well defined, then you have to think about the way you're holding it, and therefore it's not as seamless and as instantaneous as it is in the real world, or by having your hand disappear. Hands are
a problem. And of course, if you would, the thing about those games at the moment, or those systems at the moment, is you pick up an object, you're right, it's not very finesse. If I was picking up an object to show it to somebody, I would plan ahead and use a very specific gesture, and or pose of my hand. If I was showing a tin of beans to somebody, I'd pick it up on the top and the bottom because I want them to be able to read around. So and so that.
But in VR,
Job Simulator, I don't have that option. I'll pick it up and the label will be covered because I don't have the finesse. So yes, if you wanted a PhD player, you wanted a PhD in this area at the moment, then focusing on how people use their hands intelligently is a mine of good metaphors, good systems, hardware even that allows somebody to use their fingers in a sophisticated way. And the can of beans analogy is a great one I've used with a student in the past, where think about what if you're somebody going to pick it up, but then they do something specific with it, they'll do it in a different way. And you want to facilitate that because the object is a communication device. As long as you don't want to just eat it.
Well, we're kind of coming to time, but I've got two questions I must ask you.
Yes.
One is about book recommendations. So I'll start with that. What book recommendations could you give us, either within the field or just general books within life that you particularly enjoyed?
So for people that do virtual reality, I get asked this a lot, and I'm afraid I just have to point them at my bookshelf and say, well, I've read a wide range. So if you want to know about virtual reality, then Jason Gerald's book about the virtual reality book is a good starting point. But I do suggest people read because the older texts, right? So read Howard Rheingold's old book. I'm struggling to remember the name of it, about virtual reality. Or Roy Kalowski's book about the science and engineering of virtual reality. It came out in 1992. So it's a retrospective on VR from the early 90s. Okay, so that gives you an idea that this isn't new. And then on the breadth is another question. I've had interesting discussions about books about how people understand space. So I'm looking at my shelf now where the things I've read recently. I forgot the name of the author, but I read a book about disability recently called What Can a Body Do? I'm afraid I don't remember the author, but it was really interesting about how you make things accessible. And that's a grand challenge for the field is one of my personal sales points, especially to research councils at the moment, how to make a very accessible system. Can we use VR to make the real world more accessible? And how do we make after we've made VR accessible? Because of course that's a proximate challenge as it becomes more useful. And then if people want to get into the sort of neuroscience, then I think the book Surfing Uncertainty is being for me quite by Andy Clark has been quite inspirational, and there's quite a few there's sort of cognition and neuroscience books which are sort of more accessible to the public, though they are sometimes challenging.
Lovely, wonderful.
And of course, I read around architecture and art as well. So for most people that have seen some VR system, I would recommend the book Virtual Art as well, just to have a look at what artists have been doing in this field for the last 20, 30 years, because it'd be inspirational about what the interface should be, what does the system know about the person.
And then the second question was around theories. I particularly like Solomon's paradox, which is it's easier to give someone else advice about what they should do than to perhaps give yourself that advice. So I was wondering if there's any theories or perhaps even observations of life that stick with you.
That's a real challenge after speculate. I think the one thing. So I train a lot. I supervise. I've had the pleasure of supervising a lot of students over the years, and the one thing I would like to convey to them is not to be afraid of experimenting with the systems, and wandering into fields where they don't feel expert, because as a research career or a development career is to go away, build, test, And some people will be annoyed, but they'll be annoyed and then they'll tell you why they're annoyed, and then you'll do good development and research together. So that would be my main advice. You broaden the question quite a bit.
I think that fits well, though. Essentially, don't be afraid of uncertainty, which kind of fits with a lot of the field.
Yeah, and build. If build a system and try it. So I had the pleasure of working with theatre directors, an opera director, and so on, and I felt way out of my depth. But you've got something interesting to talk about because I had lovely conversations with people about avatars, and this was with somebody who trains opera singers, how they use their eyes. And if you think through, actually, we've got a common problem, which is limited information, hard to see what's going on, but somebody has to act, and so don't be afraid of those, because you might be quartering at cross purposes for a short time, but very quickly you'll come to, hopefully you'll come to a common problem.
Wonderful.
And,
well, it's been fantastic to talk to you, Professor Steed. Thank you very much for your time, and really grateful for you to join us here on Building New Realities.
Thank you.
I'm just going to push pause now.